I think we have a similar view on recoil springs. I'm not super big on changing them if they're still delivering the feel that I want in terms of the slide reciprocating, which in my experience, it can be a very, very long time. A very long time. I've been doing shooting, like competitive shooting, a long time, where I'm picking a recoil spring weight and putting it into a gun and shooting it for a long time and shooting them tens of thousands of rounds without changing them. A lot of people I've seen that's crazy talk to them. Well, what do you say about that? What do you make of that?
So a lot of 2011 manufacturers recommend changing the springs at certain intervals. So like 5,000 rounds, 10,000 rounds, whatever it is. For me, when I first get a 2011, what I like to do is I like to take a spring gauge, which is, I have one of these right here. And it's about $25, $30. It's basically just a screw with a tunnel and a fishing gauge to weigh a fish. It's pretty cheap. They're not that expensive. But what I like to do when I first get a 2011 is take the recoil spring out of it, and I like to measure the weight. And then randomly throughout maintenance, like when I think about, or randomly like when I start to get up to the round count that the gun provider recommends changing it, I'll pull the spring out and I'll test it. And if it's still within the tolerances of the weight that the spring came, then I'll keep running the spring. I don't like to change the spring unless I start seeing it degrade, so to speak. Now, like if for some reason, let's say they recommend a 12-pound recoil spring in your gun and you see it degrade down to 11 pounds, I mean, sure, like, could you continue shooting that? You probably could, because there's a lot of other guns out there that can run or a lot of guns that run 10-pound springs or whatever it is, and it's this preference of the shooter. But anyway, with that being said, for me, ultimately, I would recommend, before just going to changing springs, get a spring gauge. This way, another thing too is, especially for these 2011s, and it's not just 2011s, it's gun in general, there's a lot of companies out there that produce recoil springs, and they'll label the recoil springs, I don't know, 10 pounds, 11 pounds, whatever it is. But if you put those springs on an actual gauge, sometimes they're not what is actually labeled on the back.
Well, I mean, there's some brands I've heard about, some big brands, where you might even say they're usually not.
Yeah, and so with that being said, like, instead of just take, like, if your gun manufacturer says, hey, or you need to replace every 5,000 rounds or 10,000 rounds, and you don't know what the weight of the spring is, or let's say you think you know what the weight of the spring is in your gun based on your user manual or whatever the specs were, and you go ahead and you just take a spring from that package and you just throw it in your gun, even though it says it's the same weight, it might not necessarily be. So I think the best case and best course of action as far as to handle recoil springs is check it every time that you're getting ready you feel that you need to start changing the spring out. Check the weight on the gauge, and it's going to give you a good number. It's pretty easy, and I don't think it takes that much time to do. So,
but I think all in all, the springs do last a lot longer than people really think. So they're way less accurate from the factory. The number on the package, don't believe it, but it lasts longer than you think.
Correct. Absolutely.
So if I have this gun, like let's say I put an 11-pound spring in this thing, perhaps 20,000 rounds later, it might be a 9-pound spring, 9.2 or something like that. That doesn't seem crazy to you at all, does it?
No, it doesn't seem crazy. I mean, it's funny, like us coming from a competitive standpoint, in general, we were like, everyone talks about spring weight and recoil spring to get the gun to return the way you want it to return, and to get the gun to feel the way you want it to feel. So it's not uncommon for us to dump pretty lightweight recoil springs in these guns. Now, obviously, you put lightweight recoil springs in these guns, sometimes it beats them up. And so, like, you can start to expect that you might be, risking some slide parts or something along those lines, because the gun's going to be enduring a little bit more, harsh conditions, so to speak. So with that being said, obviously you would probably want to kind of talk to a few people that have been doing this for a while before you go like changing the recoil springs substantially, but or like dropping the spring pressures. But I've seen guys do, and it's not uncommon for certain manufacturers to put out calibration kits. And their calibration kit will range from like within 4 pounds. So for instance, it could go from 8 to 12 pounds or 8 to 11 pounds, whatever the calibration kit is. So that tells me that like whatever that lowest spring weight is, you could go down to it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So yeah, in that regards, like for your staccato, like
Well,
I wouldn't say
okay, it
problem with
ships with a 7. It ships with a 7, and a lot of dudes like running a 9 or they like running a 10.
Yeah,
So
so if it drops to a 7 over the course of the spring life,
if I put an 11 in, it's like, and 30,000 rounds later, it'll probably still be like a 9.3 or something.
yeah.
It's like,
I mean, at